We'd like to welcome you back to the another session of the 11th Annual Mormon Studies Conference, Mormonism and Islam. My name is Brian Birch, and I teach in the Religious Studies program here, as well as other administrative duties. Our session for 1 o'clock is the 12 o'clock session is Mormons Building Peace in the Middle East. And we're very pleased to have three Latter-day Saint scholars who have done extraordinary work in this area, have a wealth of experience, theoretical background, and practical knowledge to really help us understand what's going on in this area of the world. So I will introduce them in succession. We'll hear from Donna Lee Bowen first, and then Bonner Ritchie, and then Omar Kader. Donna Lee Bowen is Professor of Political Science and Middle East Studies at Brigham Young University, a graduate of the University of Utah, my alma mater. In political science, she received her M.A. and Ph.D. in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations from the University of Chicago. Professor Bowen has conducted research in Morocco, Tunisia, Iran, and Egypt under the auspices of various organizations, including the Ford Foundation, the Fulbright Hayes Foundation, and other fellowships and grant opportunities. Her research and publications have concentrated on aspects of women and family planning in Middle Eastern countries. So welcome, Dr. Bowen. To her left is J. Bonner Ritchie. Bonner is Professor Emeritus of International Organizational Behavior at the Marriott School of Management at Brigham Young University and currently serves as the Scholar in Residence here at Utah Valley. After completing a Ph.D. at the University of California, Berkeley, he joined the faculty at the University of Michigan until his move to BYU in 1973. He has taught as a visiting professor at Stanford University, the University of California, at Berkeley, his alma mater, St. Mary's College, Birzeit University, the University of Jordan, and the University of Southern Europe, to name a few. It's been a pleasure of mine to work with Bonner here at UVU over the last several years, and I've enjoyed our friendship and conversation. So, Bonner, thank you for being on this panel. Finally, Omar Kader, who you heard from yesterday, our keynote speaker yesterday morning. Omar is the founder, chairman, and owner of PalTech Incorporated. He holds a Ph.D. from the University of Southern California in international relations. He served as the executive director of the United Palestinian Appeal and executive director of the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee, which is a civil rights organization. He teaches seminars at several universities and is currently chairman of the board of the Middle East Policy Council. Dr. Kader studies and lectures on focus on democracy promotion and U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. He has served as an official international election monitor in Palestine, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Morocco, Yemen, and Indonesia. As a proud former student of Utah Valley University, known then as Utah Technical College.
Sounds close enough.
One of its iterations. It says here it was called the Utah Trade Technical Institute, and that's about 4 names of this institution ago. So please join me in welcoming our panelists, and we'll hear from Dr. Bowen.
Thank you so much for inviting us at this really momentous time in our world's history where we're seeing so much go on. I have been assigned to essentially set the stage, and then my esteemed colleagues are going to tell you stories. Okay. Is this better? But then I back away naturally. I can't be that close to it. I had a professor at the University of Utah. He was my favorite professor. for my undergraduate time. His name was Francis Warmoth. And it is thanks to him that I actually remember verbatim one thing I learned from my undergraduate days. One day, when he got off the track of political theory, he looked up at the ceiling and said, "The entire history of the world is a history of bloody warfare, interrupted by brief periods of exhaustion, which we mistakenly call peace." That made a huge impression on me. And last week we had a scholar speak at BYU, Gideon Aron, who is a professor of Jewish studies at Hebrew University and does research on religious fundamentalism, suicide bombing, terrorism, and so on. Professor Aron talked about the question of where one starts when one looks at the conflicts that we see in the world today. If we start with 9/11, is that the beginning point? Or do we go back, as Osama bin Laden does, in his accusations, in the declarations that he has so articulately written out? And then do we go back farther? If we go forward, what do we see as essentially the spurs to action, the impetus to action, or to reactions? Any student of terrorism, as Professor Kader is an expert, as an expert would tell us, knows that the point of terrorism is not the initial action, it is rather the result. It is the reply, the resulting action that then sets the stage for what happens next. And what we see is, over time, a spiral of violence, stretching backward in time, stretching forward in time. Listening to Professor Aron and then thinking about how to talk about engaging with the Middle East here today led me to consider the role of religion. The difference between the social sciences and religion is that religion sets a totally different paradigm. It takes us out of time, it takes us out of place, and it tells us one imperative. And this is where Mormons and Muslims have so much in common. It tells us to make peace. And peace without reference to the actions of one person or another puts us in a place where we can no longer blame, we can no longer accuse, we can no longer act like brothers and sisters. He hit me first. No, he looked at me. We have to stop and look at things in a very different way. A Mormon apostle, Russell Nelson, in 2002, gave a profound speech on peace. Let me quote from his words. "Because of the long history of hostility upon the earth, many feel that peace is beyond hope. I disagree. Peace is possible. We can learn to love our fellow human beings throughout the world, whether they be Jewish, Muslim, or fellow Christians, whether Hindu, Buddhist, or other. We can live together with mutual admiration and respect without forsaking our religious convictions. Things we have in common are greater than our differences. Peace is a prime priority that pleads for our pursuit." The studies I've made of Islam have reinforced in me how much Islam and the lives of the Muslims that I admire are centered around peace. And we are looking at a peace that is a peace, an actual physical peace, but moreover, the greatest problem, which is peace in one's own life, peace in one's own heart. So, if we talk about engaging with the Middle East, what should we do? If we talk about engaging with the Muslim world, how do we begin to even approach the vast subject of peace in a piecemeal fashion? Okay? How do we begin to move towards the ideal of no violence against others, and also the concept of no violence against ourselves, where we begin to soothe our own spirits and to turn our hearts towards patience and negotiation? How do we turn ourselves towards respect for others rather than blaming them for problems in our own lives? Well, President Gordon B. Hinckley gave us a start. Okay? In 2000, he said, "Let us Latter-day Saints reach out to others not of our faith. Let us never act in a spirit of arrogance or with a holier-than-thou attitude. Rather, may we show love and respect and helpfulness toward them. We, meaning Mormons, are greatly understood, and I fear that much of it is of our own making. We can be more tolerant, more neighborly, more friendly, more of an example than we have been in the past." So I would suggest that if we, as Mormons, are going to engage with the Middle East, that we take President Hinckley's words seriously and pay attention to this and look at ourselves first. At Brigham Young University, I run a program that we began in 2004. It was a direct reply to the events of 9/11, where we decided that we needed to produce people that understood the Middle East, that understood the Muslim world, and that had good languages. And to this point, we've worked on Arabic. This year, we will send around 75 or 80 students of advanced Arabic to Amman, Jordan, in order to study and work. And I have found that this semester in the Middle East has been transformative in terms of the way my students look at events, the way they look at themselves, the way they look at their government. We give them some assignments. We give them actually a lot of rules. It's BYU, after all. We give them a number of assignments. But the most important assignment that we give them is they must interact with people. They're assigned to interact with people for hours every single day. And beyond this, they are told that they may not speak but 25% of the time. They are to listen 75% of the time. Okay. Now, I watched the news yesterday, and I saw some of the spokespeople talking about the congressional hearings. I'm not going to go into that. You all, I'm sure, have feelings about Representative King's work in Washington. But what struck me right at the very beginning is we're holding hearings on citizens within our own country, and we can't get their names straight. Now, how much good listening are we doing? How much engagement are we doing if we don't know who they are? Okay. Now, Mormons and Muslims have a history of not fitting in too well in the United States. And that's some of our affinity for each other, in that we tend to see a lot of similarities. We are also good at pointing out the differences. But we are in tension with our own society. We have kind of a tense, distrustful, angst-ridden setup here as we relate to the United States. If we're going to talk about engagement, we're not going to get very far if we don't have peace in our minds at some point, and if we don't have peace in our hearts. Most of all, we're not going to get very far unless we bother to learn what we're talking about. And the basis of most conversations at this point is based on a rather strong ignorance.
First of all, acknowledgement and compliments to Brian and Boyd for putting this all together. At a public university, it's a real challenge. and for the religious studies program. It's exciting to watch and be part of that. With the premise that, borrowing from the ancient Greek philosopher, that the unexamined life is not worth living, I would argue that the unexamined faith is not worth believing. And to paraphrase that one more level, what is worth examining in the faith? And over the years, the subject or content of that examination for me has become less and less theology and more the translation of simple values into action. There aren't very many simple values involved. There are very few. Loving your neighbor is one for me that I find sort of useful. And how do I translate that into action? Well, the most obvious way and the most common way is to give lots of speeches on loving your neighbor. You know, we're all good at that. But I decided that was kind of an empty process for me. And so 2 years ago, I found myself in Jordan as a member of a team of 3 people, developing a program to train and develop people who work with youth in the Muslim and or Arab world, and to give them 4 basic skills: critical thinking, decision-making, leadership, and peacemaking. Leadership and peacemaking were the 2 that I was emphasizing and working on. We put this program together, a 2-week program, sponsored and organized by King Abdullah of Jordan, funded by the Sheikh of Abu Dhabi, who has more money than most of us, and than all of us, than most of the country, as a matter of fact, 900 billion to be exact. Anyway, putting together this program to bring together people who work with youth in that world. Teachers, people who, community leaders, religious leaders, people who are involved with athletic programs of youth. And so we spent a lot of time designing it, and I was part of the conduct of the first go-around. 2-week program, 12 hours a day, for 14 days in a row. Very tiring. We had 73 people from 23 countries there. And it was a life-changing experience for me. 2 of my favorite people were a woman from Sudan. These people come from Iraq and Afghanistan and Sudan and Palestine and Lebanon and Nigeria and Ivory Coast and Zimbabwe and Liberia, so forth. Most of them young, which means under 50. People who were passionately involved in trying to change the culture of a world. And these 2 favorite people, a woman from Sudan and a man from Liberia, spent some time talking to me. The man from Liberia said at the end of one long day when I was tired and wanted to go back to the hotel and go to sleep, he said, I'd like to talk to you. And I said, okay. You know. He said, when I was 12 years old, I was conscripted into Charles Taylor's army. What was it, National Liberation Front in Liberia? I was 12 years old and I was conscripted, and as a condition of my survival, I had to kill my father. He says, now I have to make peace with the people who made me do that. Can you help me work through that? I've taught for many years, and I've never had that kind of challenge before. It was a very moving discussion of a young man who would now be 30 years old probably, struggling to come together with people who had made him kill his father as a condition of his own life. And the woman from Sudan had been tortured, raped, thrown out to die, and had recovered enough to now become a community leader in building bridges between East and West, which is Arab, African, North, South, which is Muslim, Christian, others. And she was this beautiful, articulate person who had developed, for me, the best example I have ever found of forgiveness and reconciliation in building a bridge across cultures. And we're not. Anyway, so one of the questions is, what got me to that point? What got me to that level? Well, first of all, it started with my friend Omar. I was walking down the hall one day, and Omar said, "I'm going to Jerusalem. And, I've got some family business to take care of. Would you like to go to Jerusalem sometime?" I said, "Sure, that'd be fun. I like to travel. I like to do things. I'd never been there." This was in the fall of 1981. And 2 weeks later, I got a call from Clark's Travel. For those of you who lived in Provo for a while, that was a travel agency and a clothing store. Say, "We've got to have a round-trip ticket for you to Tel Aviv. How do you want to pay for it?" And Omar was serious about going, and 2 weeks later, we were on our way to Jerusalem. I like to travel, and I like to see things, but I was totally unprepared for the experience of driving south out of Jerusalem towards Bethlehem and stopping by a home that had just been blown up by the Israeli military because a 9-year-old boy had thrown a rock at an Israeli Jeep. And so the home was a beautiful old Jerusalem limestone home had been blown up. And they can't get a permit to rebuild. The goal is for them to leave the country. But they stay on the ground in tents and attempt to reconstruct a life in a very, very difficult situation. Well, that was a very moving experience for me. We talked to lots of other people. We observed lots of other things. And to this day, I really should ask Omar to tell me why he invited me to go. I don't know why he did. Maybe he saw me as a project that needed development at that time. But we went. And I came home and read a couple of hundred books and tried to figure out a little bit more about that world. And then in 1989, had an invitation to be a visiting scholar at the BYU Jerusalem Center. And I remember asking, why me? What's going on? I don't speak Arabic. I don't know the culture. I've made one trip there. And the answer to the question came in a rather moving meeting that moved from Provo to Salt Lake. And the meeting included President Hunter and President Faust and Elder Holland. And President Hunter said, "Understand you're going to Jerusalem." And said, "Gee, I haven't decided. It's not a good time." And this was in April of 1989. I said, "Sometime I'd like to, but probably not now." And he didn't seem to hear my response. He said, "Well, can you be there by this fall?" And I said, "Gee, why?" He said, "We want you to go and build bridges to the Palestinians." And I thought, geez, that's kind of an interesting challenge. I said, "Do I teach at the Jerusalem Center?" He says, No teaching. Get acquainted with as many Palestinians as you can, build bridges, do training programs. He says, "You're in a non-controversial area." I was troubled by that comment because I've always seen myself in a very controversial world. But he said, "You do leadership training, and you train people how to be good managers," and so forth. Anyway, we went and spent the year, and I've made 30 or 40 trips since and lived about 6 years in that area. But President Hunter said, "Before you go, let me read you a scripture." And this is the scripture that he read to me. It's from Isaiah 19:23 to 25. It says, "In that day there will be a highway out of Egypt to Assyria." And then President Hunter said, "Let me substitute Jordan for Assyria." Prophets have flexibility with the scriptures. "And the Assyrian shall come to Egypt, the Egyptian to Assyria, and the Egyptian shall serve with the Assyrians. In that day shall Israel be a third with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing in the midst of the land whom the Lord of hosts shall bless, saying, Blessed be Egypt, my people, Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, mine inheritance. He said, that means there will be peace in the Middle East. He says, that means there will be peace between Jordan and Israel and with Syria. And he says, we must be part of that. He says, so that's your job. Get that started. In addition, a quote from President Faust that sort of helped me to reframe my interest. Instead of being part of a proselyting world, in terms of what we do, where is that quote? President Faust said, our first and highest priority ought to be service, not because it makes us look good, but because it's the right thing to do. In our community relations, our motivation should not be proselytizing. It ought to be trying to make the world a better place. Of course, we're happy to share the gospel with those who are sincerely interested, but it ought to be the consequence, not the motivation of what we are doing. And so, we're on our way to Jerusalem, got acquainted with a lot of people, had a wonderful experience. And the Mormon network is the variable that, for me, explains. I never did anything directly translating LDS theology or Mormonism into what I was doing. But the network was critical. That year that we lived in Jerusalem, I got a call from the director of the church center in Jordan, who invited me to come to Jordan. He'd made acquaintance with the University of Jordan. So I went over, which was a hard job in those days. I had to go, it took me 2 days to go 50 miles because Israel and Jordan did not have a peace agreement at that time. But I got to a man and gave a lecture at the University of Jordan, met a whole variety of people, including Omar and Rebecca Salty, who came from, Rebecca from this area, Omar is a Palestinian. And they introduced me to King Hussein and Queen Noor and university personnel and subsequently went back a couple of times, 3 times as a matter of fact, to be a visiting professor at the University of Jordan and at the Jordan Institute of Diplomacy, where I taught peacemaking skills to diplomats in the Jordanian Foreign Service. And of those people, one is now the education advisor to the king. One is chief of staff to the king. Other people are doing all kinds of really creative things from an opportunity, from a network, a Mormon network that opened doors to do things that have been incredibly exciting. A few years later, and including the project with what we call Generations for Peace with King Abdullah, and the development of this program, which is now in its 4th iteration. The first one was conducted in English, the rest are in Arabic, and my Arabic is not as good as Donna and Omar. And so I'm not involved in the delivery anymore. But, and then a few years later, Omar convinced me that I ought to go to Tunis with him to meet Yasser Arafat and meet with the PLO Executive Committee, which created a long-standing involvement, training programs and development work. I found that I have new neighbors. I found that I have people who I didn't really know that I knew. I grew up in a conservative Mormon world where Israel, the state of Israel, was the fulfillment of prophecy. And it took President Hunter's comment to tell me that that wasn't the case, that was not the fulfillment of prophecy, that was yet to come. And he said, I advise you to read my speech on All Are Like Unto God. And he told me to read it about 10 times, and so I decided I should read it. But even then he didn't trust me, so he read it to me. And he said, as members of the Lord's church, we need to lift our vision beyond personal prejudice. We need to discover the supreme truth that indeed our Father is no respecter of persons. Sometimes we unduly offend brothers and sisters of other nations by assigning exclusiveness to one nationality of people over another. Let me cite an example of this exclusiveness, the present problems in the Middle East. the conflict between the Arabs and Jews. We do not need to apologize or mitigate prophecies concerning the Holy Land. We believe them, but this does not give us any justification to pronounce that others of our Father's children are not the children of promise. Sometimes members of the church are offended, in the Muslim world, are offended by members of the church who give the impression that we favor the aims of the Jews. The church has an interest in all of Abraham's descendants, and we should remember that the history of Arabs goes back to Abraham through his son Ishmael, and that all are, it's too long. Jews and Arabs are both children of our Father. They are both children of the promise, both heirs to the covenant. We have love and interest in both, and the purpose of the gospel of Jesus Christ is to bring love, unity, and brotherhood of the highest order. Well, in the scripture in Isaiah that I didn't read, that I referenced, that he read, and let me finish with that. It says, well, I did read it, but I didn't explain. Said that there would be a peace treaty between Jordan and Israel. There was not in 1989. There was a peace treaty with Egypt, but not with Jordan. And he says there'll be a highway from Egypt to Assyria. And those of you who know the geography knows that highway has to go through Israel. And that couldn't be done at that time. Can you imagine how I felt the day I stood in Aqaba, Jordan, and saw the bulldozers start to build a highway following the negotiation of peace between Israel and Jordan that went from Eilat, or that went from Taba, Egypt, through Eilat, Israel, into Aqaba, Jordan. And my wife and I have traversed that many times, and there's a substantial progress and peace agreement between Israel and Jordan that's holding and that's working. And that treaty was in some respects, or that philosophical position was reinforced the day that King Hussein died. I was in Jerusalem that day and saw all of the Israeli children, school children, carrying signs that say, we love you, King Hussein. And that dates back to a time a couple of years earlier when 7 school children in a little Israeli town on the west bank of the Jordan River were at a nature lecture reserve on an island in the Jordan River. And one of the Jordanian soldiers with a scope rifle saw them, lost his senses, opened fire, and shot and killed 7 of the little Israeli girls. And I happened to be in Jordan at that time. And Queen Noor and King Hussein talked about what should be done, and he called, I can't remember if it was Yitzhak Rabin or Shimon Peres, who was prime minister, said, I want to come over. He came over to the little community where the girls lived, went to the homes, knelt down, and begged the apology of these families. That's what solidifies peace. That's what ensures a process. That's what builds relationships that transcend religious, political, social, economic conflict. It doesn't do away with them, as Randy talked about so beautifully this morning, but it allows you to transcend them, not to eliminate them, but to transcend them, to find something more important than that position. On one occasion, I was writing to a dedication of a technical school in Jordan with Queen Noor, and I asked her what the secret of King Hussein's success was. She says, well, he knows all the important people. And, I said, yeah, I know. Everybody knows all the important people. They're kings. He says, yeah, but more importantly, he knows all the unimportant people who are really the important people. And going to Israel and begging forgiveness was a critical part of that process. Okay, one last point. I've learned that in the work I do, I have to develop a theory of peacemaking. And in 30 seconds, here it is. First of all, you've got to teach people about the importance of valid information. So much of the information is not valid. You have to become a conduit of it, a creator of it, and a teacher of the significance and sacredness of valid information. Secondly, you have to develop a sense, and we heard this morning, a sense of trust, a sense of justice in a world where people can rely on systems to make good decisions. Thirdly, you have to teach the dignity of each individual, the sacredness of each person, that, in President Hunter's term, all are alike unto God. Fourth, you have to have a philosophy of liberty, not democracy. Democracy comes way later. I think the United States make a big mistake in our preaching an attempt to impose democracy. But we do have to have liberty, which means access to information. It means access to employment. It means access to education. It means a judicial system that is fair and that works honestly. But liberty must precede democracy. In the absence of that, it doesn't work. So the liberty. Fifth is the importance of reconciliation. The lessons from Nelson Mandela in South Africa. The centrality of reconciliation as a process in building peace. And lastly, we need to develop metaphors of peace. And the metaphor that I have used comes from the dinner that Omar and I sat with Yasser and Suha Arafat when she asked us why we were here, and we didn't realize at the time that the PLO was preparing to go to Oslo to negotiate peace with Israel. And she says, we must make peace for the children. She says, since 1963, the founding of the PLO, 1967, when Yasser Arafat became chair of the PLO, and then since they were married in the spring of that year, she said, since then, all this time, Yasser's been married to the PLO. Now he's married to me, and we're going to have children, and these children must grow up in peace in a Palestinian state. Therefore, it's time to change all the paradigms of the past. And so the children became my symbol. And if we had another 2 hours, which we don't, and I tell my students, when the room's empty, I'll quit talking. So Lois took a picture of about 5,000 children, and I show these pictures of children. And that's far more important than a lecture, far more important than anything else. It's the transcendent metaphor of peace. And so I would hope that all of us can find a way to reach out and make peace for the children. Take as long as you want. We don't care.
Right. There are a number of things that you learn after success. One is usually you stumble onto it and you say, ooh, I wished I'd known I could have gotten that much done by trying. And what I found is that we all go into things thinking what's going to happen next, what's the next move in the second, third, fourth, and you never really understand that your greatest limits are your own imagination. So you think, I know what's going to happen when I get there is one of the biggest mistakes you make. So I've learned that if you just open your mind and allow things to flow, you get better results than overly planning them. I realize that's not the advice you get in management classes, but there's got to be a lot of room for what we call mingle time. My experiences in the Middle East involving from dialogue groups to private sector business activity to conferences, seminars, meetings, private relationships. I even traveled with President Clinton, and they took 20 Arabs and 20 Jews on a flight to the peace signing between Jordan and Israel. And when you travel with the president, you have to stay 5 hours ahead of him because you have to get into security, they have to clear you, then you get to your hotel, you wait for him to come, then you go to the next meeting he's going to go to, and it's usually 2 hours. So you always carry a book because you're going to be sitting somewhere waiting with him or with the security till he gets there. And I found that traveling with these 20 Jews turned out to be the greatest experience. It wasn't with President Clinton, or I was on Hillary's plane, actually. That wasn't the fun part. There were 20 Jews to get to know. And they were pretty high-level Jewish people. And there's one, Letty Cotton Pogrebin, who's a pretty widely read writer in the Jewish feminist community. I learned a lot from her. We became long friends over it. I never anticipated that. I was going to get Hillary's autograph. That was that's all I asked. That's all I wanted out of life. And it turned out to be a pretty shallow goal, and I didn't get it. But I did involve in 2 projects that I underestimated the results of what I'd get. Let me just give you the 7 big projects over the last 15 years I was involved in. When you have an election, you have international standards, and the country has to prepare for an election observer team. And I went to 2 elections, one in 2006 and one in 96, 10 years earlier, for the Palestinians. And what you do is you have to read up on all the election laws and the international guidelines, and then you go out there and you rate them on how well they observe the international conditions. And so you're essentially seeing if there's compliance. There was a private sector job that I want to talk about, not a private sector, but a public health project, and I want to talk about that in a minute. Another one was a private sector project in Egypt. I'm going to talk about that in more depth. And then these others involved setting up government agencies for the Palestinians to teach them how to run their government, teach them what transparency is, what anti-corruption measures can be, what quality assurance is. And as a matter of fact, we were doing a quality assurance project on this one, and we were trying to translate it, and we couldn't find a word for quality assurance in a bureaucracy. So I called Dilworth Parkinson at BYU, and I said, how do you translate quality assurance? We found out that the word quality relates to a man or a woman's character, but not to a bureaucratic structure. And we couldn't ever translate it other than, it's like to say gooder than better or something. It wouldn't work. And we struggled with that for a long time. I'd like to tell you that we set up a good government in Palestine, and we did everything right, and we got the transparency and the anti-corruption, the civil practices and the ethics. We failed after it's about 24 months. All the projects are hard to implement out there. We implement them under U.S. government contracts. They're difficult, they're structured, we work at it, we have milestones, and they never work on time. The last project that I work on was on the board of the Palestinian American Research Council, where we raise money for scholarships for students to leave the West Bank to get masters and PhDs in this country. And there's one, we did some private sector jobs, and we all lost money on them. And we were trying to set up little businesses for people to take. Working out there is very, very hard. It's discouraging. It's not rewarding. You don't go out with the idea that you're going to do anything but succeed, and you come back and you're glad you tried, but it didn't work. And why doesn't it work? There's a million reasons they don't work. Private sector, you can't move goods and services or people or supplies or whatever. You just can't make a private sector job work unless you have a certain relationship with the Jewish side so that you can move things back and forth, and that takes a long time. But let me just talk about these 2 high-level projects. The biggest problem we've always had is, could you accomplish certain goals? And you always start with, no, nothing works out there, because that's a cynical way to do it. One was a healthcare project, and part of it is behavioral change communication within healthcare. We had child maternity health, we had child safety. 25% of children between 1 and 5, 25% are injured seriously or killed in home accidents in Gaza. And a lot of it is fires, falling, just lots of things that we were doing to stop it. But there's one that we wanted to work on, and it was that the average woman in Gaza was having a baby every 12 months. And by the time she was 25, she had the body of a 50 to 55-year-old woman who had babies every 12 months. She'd end up with 5 or 6 or 7 children by the time she was 20, 22, 23, 24. We tried to change, and we called it birth spacing. We don't call it family planning or birth control because it triggered things. Well, we knew that we weren't going to be able to get people to sign on to that. It was going to be really difficult to do. In the first 90 days on the job, someone dared go to the imam in Gaza of a local congregation and say, did you know that the woman's health is significantly improved if she can birth space her children closer to 32 months apart? And you could have as many babies as you want, but you have to spread them out so that she can regain her health. Great idea, he said. How do we do it? We were That's not the right answer. You're supposed to tell us to get lost, and we're just a bunch of colonial pigs out there trying to stop the Palestinians from expanding their population so that the Israelis could eventually make the Palestinians extinct. We had all the wrong answers. The guy said, here, do you want me to write it or you want to write it? So Mam did. He was way ahead of us. It took us 24 hours. We were planning 24 months. He wrote the article. We posted it in all the hospitals and clinics. We started working with people. Within 2 years, you could actually measure the difference in birth rates. Not reducing birth rates, but starting the spacing. And we did all kinds of things to do it. It involved what we called behavioral change communication. And that's my first experience with just don't underestimate the people that you're trying to work with, because they usually have answers to their own problems. The second one was in Cairo. We were working with businesses and trying to get them to do global practices, what we call global best practices, made them more competitive. They wanted admission into the World Trade Organization. So we brought in 500 businesses and we said, we're going to do a series of lectures, seminars, and we'd like you guys to look at what best practices are. We're going to bring in maybe 10 to 20 speakers over the next year. Who would you like? And they started putting together Michael Porter out of Harvard and this and that and the other. And finally we took a long list and we sat down with the chairs of all the business associations. And, you know, you think, now, who can we get? Who's just the greatest? Who's the Nelson Mandela of business practices? And I go in thinking that they're going to get somebody who's going to be impossible to get. And who did they ask for? They asked for Stephen Covey. And I happen to know Stephen Covey, and I know his office, and I got him the next day. And his normal $75,000 per lecture fee, he waived. And I knew we couldn't get him because he was too expensive, and we got him. I did not plan on anything, and it worked within the first week on the job. There you are thinking nothing's going to happen. It's going to be impossible to do. Everything we tried worked. Now, that doesn't always happen, but we were lucky under those circumstances. So Covey comes, he's lost his luggage, and the biggest problem turned out to find him a shirt and a tie. And we could handle that. We gave him the shirt and a tie. The manager of the Hilton where he was staying gave him his, and he kept it. Don't tell anybody. Do not tell a soul that I told you that, and tell them not to tell. All right? Now, but he did. He kept the shirt and the tie. Cracked me up. The guy's poor. Anyway, by the time we finished, we had 20, 30 great speakers. We got groups admitted to the World Trade Organization. We got Egypt admitted. We got the change in the production of food that was up for export. Over a 10-year period, thousands of jobs were created. When I go back to Gaza and I look at what we did, I see these health practices that are now standard practices. We made a huge difference. But let me just tell you where the biggest difference came from. You know, when you're talking with someone who doesn't speak English very well, the secret to communicating with someone who doesn't speak English very well is to raise your voice, right? If they don't understand, you talk louder. You know, it's like men lost. Go faster. You know, the faster you go in even the wrong direction, the more correct it is if you're a man. If you're a woman, you look at a manual or a map or something and you find it out. Anyway, when you're on a project out there, I found out that Muslims, turns out, that they have as high IQ as we do. Could you imagine that? I thought Americans had the monopoly. Yeah. And I found out that if you pose the right challenge, they will agree and modify it to fit their circumstances, and that their solutions to their own problems are a lot easier and less expensive than ours. But we just don't talk directly to them. And we don't really get the communication going. And we're just bad listeners, especially if you're a male, American, white, over 50. We don't hear anything. Even if our hearing is perfect, we just don't hear anything because we go in with scripts. We know what we want to say, And even better, we know what they're thinking and we know what to say after they talk. And we find out that they don't answer us in our anticipated ways. So my best experience is finding out that they've got good answers. They know what they're doing. They may need a little bit of help with resources, but intellectually they don't need much help in that direction. They just need us to work with them, and it works. Transfer of knowledge, technology, all of it is working very smoothly if we remain patient enough to find out what it is they want. Thank you.
We're at the end of our hour. We probably have time for one question or so, and then we'll take an abbreviated break and maybe start a few minutes late on the next session. Does anyone have a burning question they would like to ask our panelists?
We put him to sleep.
Looks like it's lunchtime. Let me bring one to you.
A year or so ago at the mosque next to USC, there was a speaker in an evening who had been in Egypt, and he'd worked with prisoners in the Egyptian prisons of a number of the criminals there, political prisoners, who were involved in terrorism throughout Egypt. And he worked with them over a period of time, and what he discovered in discussing with them was the fact that they changed because his group came in and gave them dignity. He sat down with these hardened criminals who would take anyone's life, supposedly, and as they listened to them, just as Bonner has been talking about, listened to them and dignified them, and basically all they were asking for was dignity, and he saw that their attitudes about democracy and freedom and other kinds of things over time changed. Bonner, would you like to respond to that and add some more to it? That seemed to be your theme, and I thought of that just as you were talking.
I agree. I'm not sure what it takes, in Omar's terms, for us to shut up and listen. And dignity is usually not given by pronouncement. It's given by a process, an interactive process. And it's been fun for me to see how that process works and how much time it takes to listen. And the dignity that you really give is the dignity of caring what people say, of caring what they think, of caring what they feel, of listening to their concerns and to their arguments and to their experience and to their background. And in Palestine, for example, it takes a long time. You know that, Steve, from your experience there. It takes a long time to hear the story. Everybody's got a story. And it's a long story, and it's a complicated story, and there's often violence and incarceration and death of a parent or someone. I think it was when you and I were there. Steve and I drove up to Nablus one time, to Shechem, and almost got killed, but it was a fun experience. But I did a training program for East Jerusalem Community Center to deal with traumatized children. And, we designed a workshop, and the same thing with the group in Jordan, the Peacemaking, Generations for Peace. We designed workshops, but most of the time we spent listening to the stories and then validated those stories and gave one tiny little suggestion for people to translate their story into a contemporary strategy for their own behavior. So, yeah, I agree completely.